Lin had always been different from the other Omegas in his pack, blessed or cursed, depending on one's perspective, with a gift that set him apart from everyone around him. He could sense emotional vibrations through scent, could smell the truth behind every word, could detect deception and sincerity with an accuracy that was both miraculous and terrifying. It was a rare ability, one that appeared perhaps once in a generation, and it made him invaluable as a counselor and mediator, but also deeply unsettling to those who preferred their secrets hidden. Unlike the other young werewolves who spent their time in physical training or social maneuvering, Lin preferred quiet contemplation and study. He could often be found in secluded corners of the pack territory, reading ancient texts or simply observing the world around him with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was seeing things others missed. His packmates found him strange, otherworldly, too gentle for the harsh realities of werewolf politics. But perhaps most challenging of all was Lin's romantic nature, his deep belief in the sacred power of fated mate bonds. While others saw the bonding ceremonies as political arrangements or biological imperatives, Lin believed in the old stories that spoke of souls destined to find each other across time and space. He dreamed of the moment when he would meet his other half, when the moon goddess would reveal the person who would complete his heart and soul. That belief made the revelation of his fated mate bond both the most wonderful and most terrible moment of his life. Chiron was everything the Alpha Council valued in a leader. Heir to one of the most powerful bloodlines in werewolf society, he possessed the kind of ruthless ambition and calculating intelligence that made him a natural politician and a formidable alpha. He was handsome in the way that commanded attention, with sharp features and cold eyes that seemed to see through any deception. His scent carried the authority of absolute dominance, the kind of presence that made other wolves instinctively submit. But underneath the perfect exterior, Lin's gift detected something else. A deep well of insecurity and fear, carefully hidden beneath layers of aggressive confidence. Chiron was terrified of appearing weak, of failing to live up to the expectations placed upon him, of losing the respect and power that defined his entire identity. The revelation of their bond came to Lin during a prophetic dream on the night before the great bonding ceremony. In his vision, he saw the silver thread that connected their souls, felt the overwhelming pull of recognition that could only mean one thing. They were destined for each other, chosen by the moon goddess herself to be eternal partners. But even as Lin experienced the joy of discovering his fated mate, his gift for sensing emotional truth showed him what would follow. He could smell Karen's reaction to their bond, disgust, fear, and a cold determination to reject what the moon goddess had decreed. The vision was so clear, so devastating, that Lin woke with tears streaming down his face and his heart already breaking for what was to come. The night of bonding arrived with all the pomp and ceremony that such occasions demanded. The Alpha Council had gathered representatives from every major pack, creating an audience of hundreds of the most powerful werewolves in existence. The ancient bonding ground was lit by torches and decorated with symbols that had been used in such ceremonies for millennia. Lin stood among the other unmated wolves, his heart hammering against his ribs as he felt the bond pulling him inexorably toward Chiron. Despite knowing what was coming, he couldn't help but hope that maybe his vision had been wrong. Maybe love would triumph over politics. Maybe their destined connection would be stronger than Karen's fear. When the moment came for fated mates to step forward and claim each other, Lin moved with the inevitability of fate itself. The silver thread of their bond became visible in the moonlight, stretching between them like a bridge made of starlight. For just a moment, he saw recognition flicker in Karen's eyes, felt the future alpha's shock as he realized who his destined mate was meant to be. But then Karen's face hardened with disgust and calculation. In front of the entire gathering, before witnesses who would carry the story throughout werewolf society, the heir to the Alpha Council spoke words that would shatter Lin's world. "An Omega born from a motherless branch will never become my mate," Chiron declared, his voice booming across the bonding ground. "Your blood is a mistake. Your scent is poison. I reject this false bond." The words hit Lin like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. Around them, the assembled werewolves fell silent in shock and fascination. Such a public rejection of a fated mate bond was rare but not unprecedented. especially when political considerations outweighed personal feelings. The bloodline of the Alpha Council must remain pure, Chiron continued, his voice dripping with contempt as he looked at Lin. I will not contaminate our noble heritage with the offspring of defective breeding. The reference to Lin's origins was calculated to cause maximum pain. Born to a mother who had died in childbirth and a father who had been killed in battle shortly after, Lin had been raised by distant relatives who had never let him forget that he was a burden rather than a blessing. His motherless branch status made him technically acceptable as a mate but socially undesirable. With brutal efficiency, Chiron reached out and grasped the silver thread that connected them. The bond fought against the rejection, struggling to maintain the connection that the moon goddess had created. But Charon's will was absolute, his rejection complete and public. With one sharp motion, he tore their fate apart, the spiritual energy crackling and dispersing like lightning in the night air. The pain was beyond anything Lin had ever imagined. It felt like his soul was being ripped in half, like every breath was fire in his lungs and every heartbeat was agony in his chest. The severed mate bond left wounds that went deeper than flesh and bone, spiritual injuries that would never fully heal. He collapsed to his knees in the center of the sacred ground, his body convulsing as the magical feedback tore through him. What followed was systematic humiliation designed to erase every trace of Lin's former status within werewolf society. The council elders stripped him of his family markings, the tattoos and scars that identified him as a member of his adoptive clan. They removed his name from the pack rolls, erasing his identity as if he had never existed. You are no longer Lin of the northern clans, the chief elder declared as they burned away his identifying marks. You are nothing. You belong nowhere. You have no name, no family, no place among the strong. The physical pain of losing his markings was nothing compared to the spiritual agony of losing everything he had ever known. His home, his identity, his purpose, his future. All of it was stripped away in a single night because he had been foolish enough to believe that love might triumph over politics. They cast him out at dawn, driving him from the territory with nothing but the clothes on his back and the still bleeding wounds where his family markings had been burned away. As Lin stumbled down the mountain paths he had known since childhood, he could hear the pack's howls echoing behind him, not mourning his loss, but celebrating his removal, as if expelling him had cleansed some contamination from their bloodline. The exile was brutal in ways that Lin had never imagined. Without the support of his pack, without the communal energy that sustained all werewolves, his body began to fail. The severed mate bond had left him with a spiritual wound that refused to heal, draining his strength and making even simple tasks nearly impossible. His gift for sensing emotional truth became a curse, bombarding him with the fear and hostility of every creature he encountered. For weeks, he wandered the borderlands between werewolf territory and the wider supernatural world, surviving on whatever he could find or scavenge. His once careful grooming deteriorated into the desperate appearance of someone who had been cast out to die. The burned marks where his family identifiers had been removed marked him as an exile to any supernatural being who might see them. It was during his third week of wandering that Lin's strength finally gave out. He had been trying to find shelter from a brutal mountain storm when he collapsed in the ruins of an ancient temple, his body finally surrendering to the combination of starvation, exposure, and spiritual exhaustion. The temple was old beyond memory, its stones carved with symbols from civilizations that had been dust for millennia. As consciousness faded, Lin thought with bitter irony that at least he would die in a place that had once been sacred, surrounded by the remnants of prayers and hopes that had also been forgotten by the world. It seemed fitting that he should end where other forgotten things had come to rest. But death was not to be his fate. When awareness returned, Lin found himself staring up at a face that belonged in the pages of ancient legends, rather than the mundane world of exile and suffering. The man looking down at him was tall and lean, with features that seemed carved from marble and skin that held an almost luminous quality. His hair was dark as midnight and his eyes were the color of molten gold, with pupils that held depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades. When he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had never been questioned. Interesting, the stranger said, his golden eyes studying Lin with clinical detachment. A werewolf Omega, cast out and dying, who somehow managed to cross into dragon territory without being incinerated on sight. Either you're remarkably lucky or remarkably foolish. Dragon. The word sent a chill through Lin's exhausted mind. He had stumbled into the domain of one of the great WYRMS, the ancient beings who ruled vast territories through a combination of magical power and ruthless intelligence. Dragons were not known for their mercy toward trespassers, especially werewolves who had long been considered inferior beings by draconic standards. Legally, you are my prize, the dragon continued, circling around Lin's prone form like a hunter examining wounded prey. You crossed my borders without permission, violated my territory, contaminated my sacred spaces with your presence. I would be within my rights to kill you and display your corpse as a warning to other would-be intruders. Lin tried to speak, to beg for mercy or at least a quick death, but his throat was too dry and his strength too depleted to form words. He could only lie there and wait for whatever fate this ancient being decided to impose upon him. However, the dragon said, his tone shifting slightly, I don't kill broken things. There's no sport in it, no satisfaction in destroying what has already been destroyed by others. You will serve me instead. Consider it a more creative form of execution. Death by 1,000 small indignities rather than one grand gesture. The dragon's name, Lin learned over the following days, was Aster, and he was indeed as ancient and powerful as his presence suggested. His domain consisted of a vast mountain range that had been shaped by draconic magic over millennia, with valleys that bloomed in eternal spring and peaks that touched the very edge of the sky. At its heart stood his castle, a structure of impossible beauty that seemed to grow from the living rock itself. Aster's treatment of his new servant was coldly efficient rather than actively cruel. Lin was given basic quarters in the castle's lower levels, adequate food and clothing, and a series of tasks that were designed to keep him occupied rather than truly useful. He cleaned ancient weapons that would never be used, organized books in languages he couldn't read, and maintained gardens that grew in defiance of every natural law. What struck Lin most about his new situation was the complete absence of deception in Aster's behavior. The dragon was cold, distant, and imperious, but he was also utterly honest about his motivations and intentions. Unlike the werewolves who had hidden their cruelty behind traditions and politics, Aster was transparent about seeing Lin as property rather than a person. For someone whose gift allowed him to detect emotional falsehood in everyone around him, Aster's brutal honesty was almost refreshing. There were no hidden agendas to decipher, no subtle manipulations to navigate, no false kindnesses that concealed deeper malice. Aster was exactly what he appeared to be, a being of immense power who saw Lin as a useful object and treated him accordingly. As the weeks passed, a strange dynamic developed between them. Lin performed his assigned tasks with quiet efficiency, never complaining or attempting to negotiate for better treatment. He seemed to have accepted his fate with a resignation that was both admirable and heartbreaking. For his part, Aster began to observe his new servant with something approaching curiosity. It was during one of these observations that Aster first noticed something unusual about Lin's behavior. The Omega had been assigned to catalog a collection of ancient texts, work that should have been meaningless drudgery for someone who couldn't read the languages involved. But instead of simply moving books from one shelf to another, Lin was taking time to examine each volume, running his fingers over the ancient bindings and studying the symbols with intense concentration. "Can you read those?" Aster asked one evening, appearing in the library doorway with the silent grace that characterized all his movements. "Not the words," Lin replied without looking up from the tome he was examining. "But I can sense the emotions that went into creating them. This one was written by someone who was deeply in love. This one by someone who was terrified. This one by someone who was trying to preserve knowledge that was being lost." It was the first time Lin had spoken more than a few words since his arrival, and Aster found himself intrigued by both the information and the calm way it was delivered. An empathic reader. That's a rare gift, especially among werewolves. "It's what got me exiled," Lin said with matter-of-fact acceptance. My former pack found it unsettling to have someone around who could always tell when they were lying. And your mate? Aster asked, though he wasn't sure why he wanted to know. Did he find it unsettling as well? Lin was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still tracing the ancient binding of the book in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. He found it inconvenient. Hard to build a political career when your fated mate can smell every deception you tell. The conversation might have ended there, but something in Lin's tone made Aster linger in the doorway. Do you regret it? The gift that cost you everything. I regret trusting someone whose scent told me he was lying, Lin replied. But I don't regret being able to sense truth. It's the only thing that keeps me sane in a world where everyone else seems comfortable with deception. It was a subtle criticism of werewolf society, delivered without anger or bitterness, and it made Aster see his servant in a new light. Here was someone who had been destroyed not for any failing of his own, but for possessing a gift that revealed the failings of others. The injustice of it was almost poetic in its cruelty. From that night forward, Aster found himself paying more attention to Lin's behavior and reactions. He noticed how the Omega never asked for anything, never complained about his treatment, never showed any sign of the resentment or despair that most prisoners would display. He worked steadily and competently, accepted whatever assignments he was given, and seemed to have found a kind of peace in his reduced circumstances. More intriguingly, Aster began to notice that Lin's presence was having an effect on the castle itself. The ancient stones seemed to respond to the Omega's quiet attention, becoming warmer and more welcoming. Plants that had grown wild and untended for decades began to flourish under his care. Even the magical wards that protected the domain seemed more stable and responsive when Lin was nearby. You're affecting my territory, Aster observed one evening as they shared what had become a routine dinner in the castle's main hall. The dragon had initially intended to eat alone while Lin took his meals in the servants' quarters, but he had found himself curious about his servants' thoughts and opinions. I'm sorry, Lin said immediately, setting down his fork with the careful precision that characterized all his movements. I didn't realize I was causing problems. What should I stop doing? I didn't say it was a problem, Aster corrected, studying Lin's face for signs of deception that he knew he wouldn't find. I said you were affecting it. The castle is more responsive. When you're working in it, the magic flows more smoothly. Even the weather seems more stable. Lin looked puzzled by this information. I don't have any magical abilities beyond the empathic reading. I wouldn't know how to affect a dragon's domain even if I wanted to. Perhaps it's not about magical ability, Aster mused. Perhaps it's about intent. You care for things in a way that most beings don't. You treat ancient books like precious artifacts, tend gardens like they're living beings, clean weapons like they're sacred objects. Intent has power, especially in places where magic has soaked into the very stones. It was the first time Aster had offered anything approaching praise for Lin's work, and the Omega's reaction was subtle but noticeable. His scent shifted slightly, becoming warmer and more complex, carrying notes of surprise and gratitude that he didn't express in words. You smell different when you're pleased, Aster observed, his draconic senses far more acute than any werewolf's. More like sunlight and growing things, less like winter rain. Lin flushed at having his emotional state so accurately read. My gift works both ways. I can sense others' emotions, but I also project my own more strongly than most people. It's part of why my pack found me unsettling. I don't find it unsettling, Aster said, and was surprised to realize that he meant it. I find it honest, refreshing, after centuries of dealing with beings who hide their true thoughts behind layers of deception and political calculation. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship, though neither of them recognized it at the time. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, their interactions began to shift from master and servant to something more complex and undefined. Aster began asking for Lin's opinions on various matters, from the organization of his library to the management of his territory. Lin, for his part, began to open up about his thoughts and observations, sharing insights that often surprised the ancient dragon with their wisdom and clarity. It was during one of their evening conversations that Lin asked the question that would change everything between them. "If you had been my fated mate," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the fire burning in the hearth, "would you have rejected me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Aster found himself considering it with more care than such a hypothetical should have warranted. When he finally answered, his voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. "I would have burned down your entire pack to ensure that no one would dare reject you," he said, his golden eyes meeting Lin's with absolute certainty. "I would have made it clear that anyone who harmed or humiliated you would face the full fury of draconic wrath. I would have made you untouchable." The intensity of his response took them both by surprise. Lin's scent shifted dramatically, becoming warm and complex in ways that spoke of emotions too deep and complicated for words. For his part, Aster felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in centuries. A protective instinct that went far beyond mere ownership of a useful servant. "Why?" Lin whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Because," Aster said, moving closer without consciously deciding to do so, "you are the first being I've encountered in 5 centuries who has never once lied to me, never tried to manipulate me, never attempted to gain advantage through deception. You are honest in a way that most creatures aren't capable of being. That kind of truth is precious beyond measure." The kiss that followed was gentle and tentative, as if both of them were afraid that sudden movement might shatter the moment like glass. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, their faces flushed with surprise and possibility. "I don't understand," Lin said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You said I was your property, that I was here to serve until I died. Why would you want?" "Because ownership and caring aren't mutually exclusive," Aster replied, his hand gentle as he traced the line of Lin's jaw. "Because somewhere between watching you tend my gardens and listening to you discuss ancient literature, I stopped seeing you as a broken thing that had wandered into my territory and started seeing you as someone I wanted to protect and cherish." "But I'm an exile," Lin protested. "A rejected Omega with no family, no pack, no status. What could I possibly offer someone like you?" "You could offer me truth," Aster said simply. "You could offer me the peace that comes from being with someone who can't lie, won't manipulate, and doesn't want anything from me except my honest company. You could offer me the kind of relationship I thought was impossible after centuries of dealing with beings who saw me only as a source of power to be used or feared." What followed was the beginning of a courtship unlike anything either of them had experienced before. Aster approached Lin with the patience and care of someone who understood that trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild. He showed his affection through small gestures, preparing meals that catered to Lin's preferences, creating comfortable spaces where the Omega could pursue his interests, sharing stories and knowledge that revealed the depths of his own character. For his part, Lin responded to Aster's courtship with a growing warmth and openness that transformed his entire demeanor. The quiet resignation that had characterized his early days in the castle gave way to genuine happiness, a sense of purpose and belonging that he had never experienced even before his exile. Their physical relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on a foundation of trust and genuine affection. Aster was a patient and generous lover, using his centuries of experience not to dominate but to worship, showing Lin depths of pleasure and intimacy that he had never imagined possible. For someone who had been rejected and cast out, the experience of being desired and cherished was almost overwhelming in its intensity. "You're perfect," Aster whispered against Lin's skin as they moved together in ancient rhythm. "Everything about you is exactly as it should be." "I'm broken," Lin protested, though the words carried less conviction than they once had. "You're healed," Aster corrected, his hands gentle as they mapped every inch of Lin's body. "You're whole. You're mine if you want to be." "Yours," Lin agreed, the word feeling like a promise rather than a surrender. "Always yours." Their relationship might have continued to develop in peaceful isolation, but the outside world had other plans. It was during their 4th month together that refugees began arriving at the borders of Aster's territory, seeking sanctuary from what they described as a growing campaign of persecution against mixed heritage beings and those who associated with non-werewolf supernatural creatures. The first refugee to reach them was a child, a hybrid of snake shifter and human heritage who had been abandoned by both communities for his unusual nature. The boy, who called himself Ilian, was perhaps 8 years old, with the kind of wide, frightened eyes that spoke of trauma and abandonment. "Please," the child whispered when Aster and Lynn found him collapsed at the border of the dragon's domain. "They said you might help people like me, people who don't belong anywhere." Lynn knelt beside the boy without hesitation, his empathic abilities immediately picking up on the child's complex emotional state. Fear, certainly, but also hope and a desperate need for acceptance that resonated with his own experiences of rejection and exile. "You belong here," Lynn said firmly, gathering the child into his arms with the natural protectiveness of someone who understood what it felt like to be cast out. "No one will ever tell you that you don't belong again." The decision to take in Ilian was made jointly by Lynn and Aster, though it felt less like a choice than a recognition of something that had already happened. The child bonded immediately with Lynn, seeming to recognize in him someone who understood what it felt like to be rejected for circumstances beyond his control. For his part, Lynn felt a fierce paternal instinct awaken in him, a protective love that was both overwhelming and completely natural. "We're going to be fathers," Aster said that night as they tucked Ilian into bed in what had quickly become his permanent room. "We are," Lynn agreed, his heart full of joy and purpose. "And we're going to make sure he knows every day that he's wanted, that he's loved, that his differences make him special rather than wrong." Ilian proved to be a remarkable child, intelligent and resilient despite his traumatic early experiences. His mixed heritage gave him abilities that few beings possessed: limited shapeshifting between human and serpentine forms, resistance to most poisons, and an intuitive understanding of both human and shifter cultures. Under Lynn and Aster's careful guidance, he learned to see these gifts as advantages rather than curses. "Papa Lynn," Ilian said one evening as they worked together in the garden, using his serpentine flexibility to reach places that would have been difficult for others to access. "Why do some people think being different is bad? Because they're afraid?" Lynn replied, watching with pride as his adopted son carefully tended to plants that required specialized care. "They're afraid of things they don't understand, afraid of change, afraid of admitting that maybe their way isn't the only way. But being different is what makes us special, right?" "Right?" Lynn confirmed, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "Being different gives us unique perspectives, special abilities, the capacity to see solutions that others might miss. Like how you can sense emotions and Papa Aster can control the weather?" "Exactly like that," Lynn said with a smile. "And like how you can move in ways that others can't and understand languages that most people have forgotten. Your differences aren't problems to be solved. They're gifts to be celebrated." As Ilian grew and thrived under their care, more refugees began to find their way to Aster's domain. Word had spread through the supernatural underground of a place where mixed heritage beings could find acceptance, where differences were celebrated rather than condemned. The dragon's territory became an unofficial sanctuary for outcasts and exiles from across the supernatural world. But this growing reputation also attracted unwanted attention from those who saw such acceptance as a threat to traditional hierarchies and pure bloodline policies. Reports reached them of werewolf packs mobilizing against what they called contamination centers, of campaigns to eliminate mixed heritage beings and their protectors. "They're calling it a purification war," one of their newest refugees reported, a young vampire werewolf hybrid who had barely escaped a coordinated attack on his community. "The Alpha Council is leading a coalition of pureblood factions. They say that mixing of bloodlines weakens all supernatural species, that places like this are threats to the natural order." "And what of my former pack?" Lynn asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The northern clans are at the forefront of the movement," the refugee replied. "Your former mate, Chiron, has been appointed as the council's chief enforcer. They say he's particularly motivated to eliminate what he calls the Omega who chose corruption over purity." The news hit Lynn like a physical blow, bringing back memories of his rejection and exile with painful clarity. But instead of the despair he might have expected, He felt a growing anger at the injustice of it all. He had found happiness and purpose in exile, had built a family and community based on love and acceptance, and now those who had cast him out wanted to destroy even that small refuge. "What do we do?" Ilian asked, his young voice carrying fear but also determination. "They want to hurt us just for existing, just for being different." "We defend ourselves," Aster said, his golden eyes blazing with draconic fury. "And we protect those who have sought sanctuary with us. No one threatens my family without facing the consequences." "Our family," Lynn corrected gently. "And our people. This isn't just about us anymore, Aster. It's about everyone who has ever been cast out for being different. Everyone who has ever been told they don't belong." The preparation for war was unlike anything Aster had undertaken in centuries. Dragons were typically solitary creatures who defended their own territories but avoided involving themselves in the politics of other supernatural species. But this conflict was different. It was about the right of beings to exist without conforming to arbitrary standards of purity and tradition. More importantly, it was about protecting the family and community that Aster and Lynn had built together. The dragon found himself caring more about their refugees and adopted son than he had about anything in his long existence, and he was prepared to face any threat to keep them safe. "I want to offer you something," Aster said one evening as they watched Ilian play with several other young refugees in the castle gardens. "A formal bonding, a legal union that would give you protection under draconic law." Lynn was quiet for a long moment, his empathic abilities picking up on the complex emotions behind Aster's offer. Love, certainly, but also fear and a desperate desire to protect him from the coming conflict. "You're offering to marry me to keep me safe," Lynn said finally. "To give me legal status that might protect me if something happens to you." "I'm offering to marry you because I love you," Aster corrected. "The protection is just a practical benefit of formalizing what already exists between us." "But it would make me your spouse, not your equal," Lynn replied. "I would be under your protection, behind your shield, defined by my relationship to you rather than by my own worth." Aster studied Lynn's face, reading the emotions there with the acute perception that came from months of intimate knowledge. "You don't want to be my refuge. You want to stand beside me, not behind me." "I want to be your partner in every sense of the word," Lynn confirmed. "I want to face whatever comes together as equals. I don't want to be the person you protect. I want to be the person who fights alongside you." It was a declaration of independence that spoke to the strength Lynn had developed during his time in exile, the confidence he had gained through Aster's love and acceptance. The rejected Omega who had arrived broken and defeated had transformed into someone who knew his own worth and refused to accept anything less than true partnership. "Then we face this together," Aster agreed, pulling Lynn close. "As equals, as partners, as a family united against those who would destroy us for the crime of choosing love over prejudice." The conflict they had been preparing for arrived sooner than expected. Scouts reported a massive army approaching their borders, hundreds of werewolves from dozens of packs, supported by pure-blood vampires, traditional dragons who disapproved of Aster's policies, and other supernatural beings who saw mixed heritage communities as threats to their way of life. At the head of this army rode Chiron himself, now fully grown into his role as the Alpha Council's chief enforcer. He had changed in the months since rejecting Lynn, becoming harder and more ruthless, his once handsome features marked by the kind of cruelty that came from suppressing one's own conscience in service of political necessity. "Aster of the Eastern Mountains," Charon's voice boomed across the valley as his army assembled before the dragon's territory. "You stand accused of harboring enemies of supernatural purity, of encouraging the contamination of noble bloodlines, of creating a haven for abominations that threaten the natural order. Surrender those under your protection, and your own life will be spared." Instead of responding with threats or defiance, Lynn made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He stepped forward from the walls of Aster's castle, visible to the entire army, and spoke with a voice that carried clearly across the distance. "I am Lynn, once of the northern clans, now of the eastern mountains," he called out, his tone calm but carrying an authority that made even hardened warriors take notice. "I am the Omega you cast out, the fated mate you rejected, the exile you now seek to destroy. But I am no longer the broken creature you remember. I have found love, family, and purpose in the place you condemned me to. I stand here not as your victim, but as your equal." A murmur of shock rippled through the assembled army. Many of them remembered the rejected Omega, the pathetic figure who had been cast out in shame and disgrace. The confident leader standing before them bore little resemblance to that broken individual. "You speak with borrowed courage," Chiron called back, though his voice carried less certainty than it had before. "You hide behind dragon protection and call it strength." "I speak with the courage that comes from knowing my own worth," Lin replied. "I stand not behind protection, but beside those who have chosen to stand with me. We are not abominations or contaminations. We are beings who have found strength in diversity, love in acceptance, and hope in the possibility of something better than the fear and hatred you represent." To demonstrate his point, Lin began to project his emotions outward, using his empathic abilities not to attack but to share. He let the assembled army feel what he had felt. The pain of rejection, yes, but also the healing that had come from love, the joy of family, the peace that came from being accepted for who he truly was. The effect was immediate and profound. Warriors who had come expecting to find broken creatures cowering and hiding instead felt waves of contentment, love, and genuine happiness. They experienced, secondhand, the reality of what Lin and his community had built. Not a desperate refuge for the unwanted, but a thriving society based on mutual respect and acceptance. "This is what you seek to destroy," Lin continued, his voice carrying both sorrow and determination. "Not weakness or contamination, but strength found through unity. Not perversion of natural law, but evolution beyond the limitations that have kept us isolated and suspicious of one another." Many in the army began to shift uncomfortably, their earlier certainty shaken by the emotional truth they were experiencing. Some looked around at their companions with new eyes, seeing for the first time the fear and hatred that motivated their campaign rather than the noble purpose they had been told they served. But Chiron remained unmoved, his own emotional defenses too strong to be penetrated by Lin's empathic projection. "Pretty words and emotional manipulation," he snarled. "But the law is clear. Mixed bloodlines weaken all supernatural species. Those who encourage such contamination must be eliminated." "Then you force us to defend ourselves?" Aster said, stepping up beside Lin with the kind of presence that made the very air shimmer with draconic power. "But before we begin a war that will cost hundreds of lives, I offer you an alternative." "What alternative?" Chiron demanded, though his tone suggested he was not particularly interested in negotiation. "Single combat," Aster replied. "Your champion against ours, winner takes all. If your representative wins, we will surrender those you seek and accept whatever judgment you impose. If ours wins, you will withdraw your armies and leave our communities in peace." It was a dangerous gamble, but it offered the possibility of resolving the conflict without the massive loss of life that open warfare would entail. More importantly, it placed the burden of the fight on individuals rather than forcing their refugees and adopted son to participate in a battle that could destroy everything they had built. Karen's response was swift and predictable. "I accept and I name myself as our champion. I will face this dragon in single combat and prove once and for all that traditional strength is superior to corrupted power." "No," Lin said quietly, his voice carrying across the valley with surprising authority. "You won't be facing Aster." Both armies stirred with confusion at this announcement. If not the dragon, then who would serve as champion for their community? "You'll be facing me," Lin continued, his tone calm but carrying absolute conviction. "This conflict began with your rejection of me, with your declaration that I was unworthy of love or acceptance. It should end the same way, between us, with truth rather than politics determining the outcome." The suggestion caused an uproar among both armies. An Omega challenging an Alpha to single combat was virtually unheard of, especially when that Omega had been publicly rejected and exiled. Even Aster looked concerned, though he trusted Lin's judgment enough not to immediately object. "You would face me?" Chiron asked, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and contempt. You, the broken Omega who couldn't even maintain a mate bond? You think you can stand against Alpha strength? I think, Lin replied calmly, that strength comes in many forms, and that the kind of power that destroys is ultimately weaker than the kind that builds. I think that love is stronger than hatred, acceptance stronger than prejudice, hope stronger than fear. And I think that someone who has learned those lessons is more than capable of facing someone who has learned only to destroy. The combat that followed was unlike anything witnessed in supernatural history. Instead of the brutal physical confrontation that most expected, it became a battle of wills, of competing visions for what their society could become. Lin fought not with claws and fangs but with truth, using his empathic abilities to force Chiron to confront the reality of what his rejection had created. He made the Alpha feel the pain and isolation of exile, but also the healing that had come from finding acceptance elsewhere. He shared the joy of building a family based on choice rather than obligation, the satisfaction of creating a community where differences were celebrated rather than condemned. More devastatingly, he forced Chiron to confront his own emotions, the fear and insecurity that had driven him to reject his fated mate in the first place. Through their renewed connection, Lin revealed the loneliness that had haunted Chiron since their separation, the growing realization that political advancement was no substitute for genuine love, the secret knowledge that he had made the greatest mistake of his life. You were afraid, Lin said as they circled each other in the neutral ground between the armies. Afraid of what accepting me would mean, afraid of appearing weak, afraid of losing the respect you thought you needed to survive. But fear is not strength, Chiron. Fear is what makes us small, what keeps us isolated, what prevents us from becoming everything we could be. I did what was necessary, Chiron snarled, but his voice carried less conviction than it had before. I protected the bloodline, maintained the traditions that have kept us strong for generations. You sacrificed love for politics, Lin corrected. You chose fear over courage, isolation over connection, tradition over growth. And what has it gained you? Are you happier now than you were before you rejected me? Are you more complete, more fulfilled, more at peace with yourself? The questions hit Chiron like physical blows because his own emotions, laid bare by Lin's empathic abilities, provided the answers. He was not happier, not more complete, not at peace. He had gained political power at the cost of everything that might have made that power worthwhile. It doesn't matter, Chiron said desperately. What's done is done. We can't change the past, can't undo the choices we've made. No, Lin agreed, but we can choose what to do with the future. We can choose to learn from our mistakes rather than repeating them. We can choose to build rather than destroy, to accept rather than reject, to love rather than hate. The emotional intensity of their confrontation was affecting both armies, as warriors on both sides found themselves experiencing echoes of the pain and healing that Lin was sharing. Many began to question the purpose of their campaign, to wonder whether the beings they had come to destroy were really the threats they had been told they were. It was Ilion who provided the decisive moment in the conflict. The young hybrid, despite being told to remain in the safety of the castle, had made his way to the edge of the combat ground where he could watch his adoptive father face his former tormentor. Papa Lin, he called out, his young voice carrying clearly across the assembled armies. Remember what you taught me. Being different is what makes us special. The simple words, spoken with the absolute faith that only a child could possess, crystallized everything that the conflict was really about. Here was a being who had been rejected by two different communities for his mixed heritage, who had found love and acceptance only in the sanctuary that Lin and Aster had created. He was living proof that diversity was strength, that love could transcend the boundaries that tradition sought to maintain. The sight of the child, clearly cared for, obviously loved, radiating the kind of confidence that came from knowing he was valued, broke through the last of Karen's emotional defenses. For the first time since rejecting Lin, he allowed himself to truly see what his choice had cost, not just for himself but for everyone who might have benefited from a different decision. I was wrong, Chiron said suddenly, his voice carrying clearly across the combat ground. I was wrong to reject you, wrong to cast you out, wrong to lead this campaign against the life you've built. You haven't become corrupted or contaminated. You've become everything I was too afraid to let you be. The admission sent shockwaves through both armies, but it was the sincerity behind it, detectable by anyone with empathic abilities, that truly changed the dynamic of the confrontation. Here was the Alpha who had initiated this conflict admitting that his fundamental assumptions had been wrong. I can't undo what I did, Chiron continued, his voice thick with emotion. I can't give you back the months of pain and exile, can't pretend that my rejection didn't nearly destroy you. But I can acknowledge that what you've built here is not a threat to be eliminated. It's an example to be learned from. Lin felt the sincerity of Karen's words through their empathic connection, but also sensed the deeper truth beneath them. The Alpha's regret was genuine, but it was motivated as much by recognition of his own loss as by concern for the pain he had caused others. I forgive you, Lin said quietly, the words carrying across the silent battlefield. Not because what you did was right, but because holding on to anger would only poison the life I've built. I forgive you for rejecting me, for exiling me, for leading this army against my family. But I don't forgive you for them. I forgive you for me. It was a distinction that carried profound implications. Lin was not absolving Chiron of responsibility for his actions, not suggesting that the pain he had caused was acceptable. He was simply choosing to release the hold that past trauma had on his own heart. And I choose to stand by what I've built here, Lin continued. I choose the love I've found over the love I lost, the family I've created over the pack that cast me out, the future I'm building over the past that nearly destroyed me. The formal end of the conflict came not through victory in combat but through recognition of truth. The empathic sharing that Lin had initiated spread throughout both armies, forcing warriors to confront the reality of what they were fighting for and against. Many found that their certainty about pure bloodlines and traditional hierarchies crumbled when faced with the evidence of thriving mixed-heritage communities. By the end of the day, nearly half of the attacking army had laid down their weapons and requested permission to remain in Aster's territory. These were beings who had come expecting to find abominations and instead discovered examples of what their own societies could become if they had the courage to embrace change. You have given us much to think about, Chiron said during the formal negotiations that followed the end of hostilities. I cannot speak for all the packs and clans, but I can promise that the northern clans will no longer participate in campaigns against mixed-heritage communities. That's a beginning, Lin replied diplomatically. Change rarely happens all at once, but it can happen one heart, one mind, one community at a time. As the remaining traditionalist forces prepared to depart, Chiron approached Lin for a final private conversation. The Alpha looked older, worn down by the weight of recognition and regret. I want you to know, Chiron said quietly, that seeing what you've accomplished, seeing the family you've built and the community you've created, has shown me what real strength looks like. I thought I was protecting our people by maintaining purity, but you've shown me that our real strength comes from unity despite differences. What will you do now? Lin asked, genuinely curious about how someone could rebuild their life after such a fundamental shift in understanding. I'll try to be better, Chiron replied simply. I'll try to learn from the example you've set, to build rather than destroy, to accept rather than reject. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I know I have to try. That's all any of us can do, Lin said with compassion. Try to be better than we were, to learn from our mistakes, to choose love over fear whenever we have the opportunity. The months following the conflict brought dramatic changes not just to Aster's territory, but to supernatural society as a whole. Word of the Bloodline War and its peaceful resolution spread throughout the supernatural world, inspiring other mixed-heritage communities to emerge from hiding and traditional societies to reconsider their policies of exclusion. Lin found himself taking on new roles and responsibilities as representatives from various supernatural communities sought his advice on integration and acceptance. He became known as the Bridge of Blood, a title that recognized his unique ability to facilitate understanding between different groups while maintaining his own integrity and independence. The Council of United Bloods wants to offer you a formal position, Aster reported one evening as they shared dinner with Ilian and several of their other adopted children. They want to create a new office, a mediator who can help resolve conflicts between traditional and progressive communities. "And what do you think?" Lin asked, though his empathic abilities had already given him a good sense of Aster's feelings about the offer. "I think," Aster said carefully, "that you've already been doing that work informally, and that making it official would give you more resources and authority to help beings who are facing the same challenges you once did. I also think that accepting would mean spending significant time away from home, traveling to communities that may not always welcome your message." "But you support the idea?" Lin pressed. "I support whatever choice makes you happiest," Aster replied. "Whether that's taking on a formal role in supernatural politics or remaining here to focus on our family and community. Your happiness matters more to me than any political considerations." It was exactly the kind of response that Lin had come to expect from his partner. Supportive without being controlling, honest about concerns while still respecting his autonomy. Over their time together, Aster had consistently proven that he valued Lin's independence and growth, even when it might be inconvenient or challenging for their relationship. "I want to do it," Lin said after considering the implications. "Not because I need the recognition or authority, but because there are still so many beings out there who are facing the same rejection and exile that I experienced. If I can help even a few of them find acceptance or build communities where they belong, then it's worth the sacrifice." "Then we'll make it work," Aster said simply. "We'll adjust our lives to accommodate your new responsibilities, find ways to maintain our family bonds even when physical distance separates us. Love isn't diminished by the pursuit of noble goals, it's strengthened by them." The formal ceremony that installed Lin as the first mediator of the Council of United Bloods took place during the spring equinox, when the magical energies that governed supernatural society were at their most balanced and receptive. Representatives from dozens of different communities gathered to witness the historic moment when an Omega who had been cast out for his differences was elevated to one of the highest positions of authority in their world. "I accept this position," Lin said during his inaugural address, "not as recognition of my own worthiness, but as a symbol of what becomes possible when we choose acceptance over rejection, growth over stagnation, love over fear. I have been broken and rebuilt, cast out and welcomed home, rejected and ultimately chosen. I carry the scars of those experiences, but I also carry the wisdom they have taught me." Standing beside him during the ceremony were Aster, resplendent in formal draconic regalia, and Ilian, now grown into a confident young man whose mixed heritage had become a source of pride rather than shame. They were joined by the dozens of other beings who had found sanctuary in their community, creating a visual representation of the diversity and unity that Lin's new position was meant to promote. "You are not broken if you are not chosen by those who cannot see your worth," Lin continued, his voice carrying clearly to every member of the assembled audience. "You are valuable because you choose to see your own worth, because you refuse to let others' limitations define your possibilities, because you have the courage to build something beautiful from whatever pieces you have left." The ceremony concluded with a ritual that was both ancient and unprecedented. The formal bonding of Lin and Aster as equals rather than as master and servant, as partners rather than as protector and protected. They exchanged vows that they had written themselves, promises that spoke to the unique nature of their relationship and the journey that had brought them together. "I choose you," Lin said, his voice steady as he looked into Aster's golden eyes. "Not because fate decreed it, not because I needed rescue, but because you saw me when I was invisible, valued me when I was worthless, loved me when I was unlovable. I choose to build a life with you, to face whatever challenges come our way together, to be your equal and your partner in all things." "I choose you," Aster replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "Not because you serve me or need me, but because you complete me in ways I never thought possible. You brought light to places that had been dark for centuries, warmth to a heart that had grown cold with isolation, purpose to a life that had lost meaning. I choose to love you, protect you, and support you in becoming everything you are meant to be." The magical fire that witnessed their vows blazed brighter as they spoke, its light visible for miles around, as if the very elements were celebrating their union. When they kissed to seal their bond, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers that echoed across the mountains and valleys, a sound of pure joy that spoke to the hope their love represented. Years passed, and the changes that Lin and Aster had helped initiate continued to spread throughout supernatural society. The rigid hierarchies and pure bloodline obsessions that had once dominated their world gradually gave way to more inclusive and accepting communities. Mixed heritage beings found new opportunities and acceptance, while traditional societies discovered that diversity strengthened rather than weakened their foundations. Lin's work as a mediator took him to communities across the supernatural world, from werewolf packs struggling to integrate Omega rites to vampire covens dealing with half-blood members to dragon clans learning to coexist with other species. In each case, he brought not just his empathic abilities and political authority, but the wisdom that came from having experienced both rejection and acceptance firsthand. "How do you do it?" asked a young Omega who reminded Lin painfully of his former self. Quiet, gifted, desperately hoping for acceptance from a pack that saw him as a burden. "How do you keep believing that things can get better when everything seems hopeless?" "Because," Lin replied gently, "I've seen what's possible when we refuse to accept that hopelessness is permanent. I've experienced the transformation that becomes possible when someone sees your worth even when you can't see it yourself. I've built a family and a community from nothing but determination and love. If it was possible for me, it's possible for anyone." The conversation took place in the same ruined temple where Aster had first found Lin, now restored and transformed into a sanctuary for beings seeking refuge from persecution. It had become one of many such places throughout their world, each one a testament to the power of chosen love and determined hope. "Remember," Lin continued, pulling the young Omega into a gentle embrace, "you are not broken if you are not chosen by those who cannot see your worth. You are valuable because you choose to see your own worth, because you refuse to let others' limitations define your possibilities, because you have the courage to keep looking for the people who will love you exactly as you are." It was a message he had shared countless times over the years, with countless beings who had faced their own forms of rejection and exile. Some listened and found the strength to keep searching for acceptance. Others weren't ready to hear it yet. But each conversation planted seeds that might someday grow into the kind of transformation that had saved his own life. On the 10th anniversary of his formal bonding with Aster, Lin stood once again in their castle gardens, watching their adopted children, now grown into confident adults, playing with the next generation of refugees and outcasts who had found sanctuary in their community. The gardens themselves had grown wild and beautiful, a riot of colors and scents that spoke to the vibrant diversity of the beings who tended them. "Any regrets?" Aster asked, joining him on the balcony where they had shared so many important conversations over the years. "About which part?" Lin replied with a smile. "About being rejected by my fated mate, about being exiled from my pack, about being forced to rebuild my entire life from nothing, about any of it, about all of it." Lin was quiet for a moment, his empathic abilities sensing the deep contentment that radiated from everything around them. Their home, their family, their community, their love. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the conviction that came from hard-won wisdom. "No regrets," he said firmly. "Not about the rejection that freed me to find real love, not about the exile that led me to my true home, not about the pain that taught me to recognize genuine healing when I found it. Every moment of suffering was necessary to bring me here, to this life, to this love, to this purpose. Even if you could go back and change things, make Chiron accept the bond, avoid the exile and all the pain that followed. Especially not then," Lin replied with absolute certainty. "What Chiron and I might have had would have been built on obligation and fear, maintained through political necessity rather than genuine affection. What you and I have chosen to build together is based on love freely given and freely received, on partnership between equals, on the decision to keep choosing each other every day." As the sun set over their mountain sanctuary, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lin reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. From the broken Omega who had been cast out in shame to the respected mediator who had helped reshape supernatural society. From the lonely exile who thought he would die forgotten to the beloved partner and father who had found his purpose in helping others find theirs. "They burned me to ashes," he said quietly, echoing words that had become a family motto over the years. "But from those ashes, I learned to become fire." "We learned," Aster corrected, pulling him close. "We learned together. You showed me how to transform isolation into connection, how to use power in service of others rather than just for personal gain, how to love without reservation or fear. And you showed me how to transform pain into strength, rejection into self-acceptance, exile into homecoming, Lin replied. We saved each other. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their sanctuary settled into its evening routines. Students and refugees shared meals and stories, worked together on projects that would have been impossible in segregated communities, formed friendships and partnerships that crossed every traditional boundary. And at the heart of it all were Lin and Aster, the rejected Omega and the lonely dragon who had found each other in the darkness and built something beautiful together. Their love story had become more than just a personal triumph. It had become a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever felt different, cast out, or alone. Their story reminded the world that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the deepest pain, that sometimes what we think is our ending is actually our beginning, and that sometimes the people who reject us do us the greatest favor of all by freeing us to find where we truly belong. In the end, that was their greatest gift to the world. Not just the sanctuary they had built or the students they had taught, but the simple demonstration that love, chosen freely and maintained through conscious decision, could indeed transform not just individual lives but entire societies. One heart at a time, one relationship at a time, one community at a time, until love became the rule rather than the exception. They had been burned to ashes by rejection and betrayal, but from those ashes they had learned to become fire. Not the destructive kind that consumes everything in its path, but the warming kind that brings light to dark places and makes growth possible even in the harshest conditions. Their crown was made of ashes, but it was a crown nonetheless, worn with pride by those who had transformed their greatest wounds into their greatest strengths. It was a love story worth telling, a life worth living, and a legacy worth leaving. The proof that sometimes the most broken among us have the greatest capacity for healing, both ourselves and the world around us. And in a universe that often seemed determined to tear people apart, their love stood as enduring evidence that some bonds are strong enough to not only survive but to transform everything they touch.